Members, please bear with us. Thank you. So, members, I understand members online, they can hear us, but we can't hear them. Yes, we can hardly hear them. But we will proceed, since they're hearing us, while the technical folks address the problem. So I will start with my opening remarks. It is said that a journey of 1,000 miles begins with one first step. This committee is here today to continue taking more substantive steps in this journey, which will end when the prevalence of domestic violence is in the rearview mirror of our beautiful country. We're all convinced of the importance of this assignment, and so we must commit to moving with alacrity to complete this assignment. When we met in our inaugural meeting, we agreed on some broad outlines of how we are to proceed with this mammoth task. And so the advertisement was placed in the media, inviting persons to submit their comments and suggestions, and we await what we expect to be critical comments and thereafter robust interactions from these and the discussions in our committee. Among the other decisions reached was the committee having sight of a stakeholders listing from previous deliberations on the Sexual Harassment Act, which we now have in hand and also available for review, is a matrix with the comments from a previous Joint Select Committee looking at the Domestic Violence Act et al. While we meet here discussing steps to make the Domestic Violence Act a more vibrant tool for persons impacted by this scourge, steps are being taken, policies are in place, programs are impacting lives. So it's a universal approach being taken to address this problem of violence against the vulnerable. There is positive work being done by the Bureau of Gender Affairs, the Jamaica Constabulary Force, and many other organizations. I believe this shows that our commitment is real. As recent as December 2023, the ministry brought to this Honorable House amendments to the Domestic Violence Act addressing some burning critical issues. And so the current act has increased the categories of persons who may apply for a protection order to include the children's advocate and an individual, not a family member, but who has the permission of the court to do so. There is an expanded, in the list of conduct, the court prohibits the respondent from doing while a protection order is in place. So the court can direct the respondent to return property jointly owned by the prescribed person that he or she has in possession and or hand over a firearm or prohibited weapon in his possession. In addition, the respondent must take some positive actions, perpetrators, including to recompense the victim. increase the penalties for breaching a protection order, increase fines and extended prison time for a breach of the protection order is also a part of the recent amendment. But while we work, we have in place other facilities to assist victims, including the Gender-Based Violence Helpline, established in the Bureau of Gender Affairs of the Ministry. Importantly, the helpline has provided important services to over 8,000 clients since its inception, and the numbers of persons positively impacted by this service are rising daily. There is also the important continuum of care targeting survivors of gender-based violence, coordinating services such as psychosocial support and counseling, psychological first aid, safety planning, risk assessment, and a myriad of other services. And of course, for women and children in dire immediate need of removal from what can be life-threatening situations, there are our shelters to provide accommodation for women and children. And the government is in the process of refurbishing another shelter to increase the number of women and children in need who can be accommodated. But while all these steps have been taken, we will still recognize that there is a long way to go to protect the vulnerable. So here we are doing fundamental work on this act. So committee members, the charge I give us today is let's do it. Let us go back to the drawing board and get this critical review done, and done quickly. I thank you so much. At this point, I will ask for the confirmation of the minutes of the meeting held on Wednesday, March 20, 2024. Senator Longmore.
Thank you, Chair. Whilst I would move to confirm the minutes, I don't see reflected in it. And why I raise it is because the other document that we have indicating the agencies that have been invited for submissions, I don't see the reflections of the JPA, the Jamaica Psychiatric Association, or JAMPSych, Jamaica Psychological Society, both of which I had made as suggestions, and I don't see that minuted either. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Longmore. We will add those entities to the list. So I would ask for someone to second this. Thank you, Senator Gale. So members, we have in front of us the list of stakeholders for the Joint Select Committee appointed to review and report on the bill shortly entitled the Sexual Harassment Act 2019. So we have a list of stakeholders here who are specifically invited to make submissions. And the committee received submissions and heard oral presentations from the second list on this document which have been provided. We have also been provided with the matrix of submissions for the Joint Select Committee reviewing the Sexual Offences Act, the Offences Against a Person Act, and the Child Care and Protection Act, as well as the Domestic Violence Act. And so this matrix will provide us with information as to what were the considerations during those deliberations. So at this point, I would ask, I don't know if the members online, if you're hearing us okay, and if you could just say something. Let's see if we can hear you clearly.
We're hearing you.
That's better. Still a little, like there's a little reverb. But we'll try best at this end to hear your comments clearly. All right, so at this point, I would invite members to make comments as it relates to the list from the Sexual Harassment Act of stakeholders, as well as the matrix that has been provided from the Joint Select Committee reviewing several pieces of legislation impacting on the sector that we are looking at, the vulnerable. Senator Gale, go ahead.
Chair, good afternoon, everyone. And thanks for responding in providing the matrix. One of the things for this committee that would be helpful is to make a link between what was represented during those deliberations in 2017 and what made it to a legislation. And then what didn't make it, but would have been possibly fruitful recommendations, but not making it for varying reasons. Now, the legislation as it is would have defined what would have made it. The matrix would have indicated what the recommendations were. But I think there's other piece of documentation that may help the committee, and that would be the report of the committee to Parliament. That would have created the nexus between the matrix itself and what actually was implemented in the legislation. It would just make another link in terms of the representation. And I think it would be helpful for this committee to also receive the submission in terms of the report, just to make that total connection, to determine where we're coming from and to examine where we would want to go.
Thank you, Senator Gale. The clerk will send out the report immediately. You can do that?
Yeah, sure.
Right?
Thank you.
Via email.
Yes.
So we will have access to that document as well.
And Chair, you know, I would want to extend commendations for the work that has been done since the inception of this critical piece of legislation, and the fact that it is our intention to review the legislation within the parameters of the time frame that has been established. Because I consider this being ongoing work and work in progress in a very critical area of our society. Domestic violence have increased rapidly. And I think as a country, we hold it in our regard to educate the society around the measures that can take place in the prevention and the protection against domestic violence. As a trade unionist, I want to extend a further appreciation and the scope of us getting to that stage where we can get to Convention C-190 on violence and harassment, especially in light of the fact that we take it for granted what takes place in a workplace and the pressures being borne by workers of varying degrees and varying levels within an organization around violence and harassment. And so that is one added dimension to where people evolve, that we need to embark on taking on this protection. So I'm looking forward to embracing and pursuing that dialogue in relation to C-190. But I commend the government for the work that it has been doing, and the Bureau of Gender Affairs, and the establishment of a team, and balancing the need of protection against violence. So that would be my opening comments.
Thank you, Senator Gale. I should indicate here that the C-190, I'm in discussion with the Minister of Labour and Social Security. We are very much aware that we need to expedite the signing of, and certainly because of its impact on workers, and particularly domestic workers. So I don't know if Mrs. Robb can give us any update on that particular matter.
Yes, we have been working very closely with the ministry, yourself and the Minister of Labour and Social Security, and the group that would be the one championing that cause, the NGO group, that's the Jamaica Household Workers Union. They are a member of the COPE initiative, which is our community outreach through Partnership for Empowerment, and they have been strident, certainly, in their efforts to ensure that we keep it on the front burner. We have lots of discussions with them, and I know, for example, the President and her team, they have actually made a lot of inroads in terms of getting information. And I know the ministers have been speaking, our Minister and Minister of Labour. So I think we have advanced significantly in terms of the discussion and the action that have been taken. And we have actually included some of that in the last report that they had, the ILO report on the C-190. So I believe that we are very close to nailing it. It's just a collaboration that continues between ourselves, our legal team, and the legal team in the Ministry of Labour and Social Security. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Mrs. Robb. I should indicate that the Ministry of Labour and Social Security will be one of the stakeholders who will be invited to make presentations here, and we'll have an opportunity at that time to get an update on the C-190. Senator Gilead also asked to be given some idea as to what has been included in the act coming out of the Joint Select Committee that reviewed the various pieces of legislation. And we recently amended the Domestic Violence Act to address some of these which we considered low-hanging fruits. And so the current act has increased the categories of persons who may apply for a protection order, to include the children's advocate and any individual, not a family member, but who has the permission of the court to do so. Other amendments, there is an expansion in the list of conduct the court prohibits the respondent from doing while a protection order is in place. So the court can direct the respondent to return property jointly owned by the prescribed person that he or she has in possession, and also hand over a firearm or prohibited weapon in his or her possession. In addition, the respondent may take some positive actions. The perpetrator could be also asked to ensure that the victim receives compensation. Also, increase penalties for breaching a protection order, increase fines, an extended prison time for a breach of the protection order. Those are also a part of the amendment. So those were taken on board coming out of the Joint Select Committee recommendations when the various pieces of legislation were being discussed. Senator Longmore, you may wish to make any comments here regarding the matrix. And we have taken on board the two entities that you have asked us to add. Okay, thank you. Members online wish to make comments at this time?
So, Minister, Chair. Chair, I'm not sure if you're hearing me.
I'm hearing you, not as clearly as I would want to, but I'm hearing you.
I was thinking, Chair, that now that we have the matrix and that we will have the report, and that will give the committee an indication of what some of the recommendations are that were made. Perhaps going forward, what we could do, in addition to what we have agreed, is that we could write to these persons, inviting them to make submissions, but more particularly, request of them an indication as to whether they want to add it to the submissions previously made. This might save the committee, the Joint Select Committee, some time in terms of their deliberations, because if they remain the same, then we would not need to hear them again, but simply to update the recommendations which they're made. And I want to put that to you, Minister, to see if that would enable us or assist us in attaining our deadline for July.
So for clarification, we would write asking them if they wish to update their presentations, or if we can proceed with what they have recommended previously.
Yes, Minister, that was my proposal, to save the committee some time so that we can proceed expeditiously to do the work that we have been mandated to do.
Yes, I agree. It would certainly save us some time. And certainly we want to be able to complete the review of the legislation as quickly as possible. And that certainly will help in that effort. The report, I will repeat, is being sent to each member as we speak. Mrs. Robinson or Ms. Blackwood, you may wish to highlight some of the areas that we need to take into consideration at this time in putting together literally a new piece of legislation. Yeah, that I would also, I'm acknowledging Ms. Kashia West from Legal Reform, and I invite you to also make comments to highlight areas that you consider low-hanging fruits or areas that we can look at right away in order to advance our discussions here.
I think, Minister, we can look at some of the matters that were not dealt with, that we did not look at in this act because of time. We wanted to grab the first things. So we have issues such as the definitions that we had wanted to put in the act, And there's also a concern about criminalizing, making the domestic abuse a criminal act, because some persons were saying this should be done, while we had said no, there are reasons why it didn't have to be. So I think that's going to be one of the main things that's going to be considered by some of the submissions we have.
Senator Gale?
Maybe what could have been done or could be done, Ms. Blackwood, is to, whatever those submissions are, it's prepared and sent to the committee in advance of the next meeting so that we would have it. It certainly makes it easier. I recall another committee to which I am sitting on, that team prepared a list of recommendations that they would have wanted to see that never made it to the previous legislation, and it really did help in that approach. Just for clarity though, Chair, you spoke about the question of compensation for victims. Was that an amendment in the last set of amendments recently? No, it wasn't. Was it mentioned any time at all? Yes.
The victims.
The victims.
Yes.
I was trying to comb through because I recall someone who heard about the amendment to the legislation asked about that and significantly emphasize its relevance and importance, in that victims go through some serious challenges when they have to run from the household and they have to take up residence elsewhere, and the cost in relation to that and the burden in maintaining that the child or children who they have to support and the cost that they... So that person had indicated to me, and that person was unfortunately a victim of circumstances, and they had indicated that was a critical area of any legislation in terms of providing the support. So I really wanted to see what was indicated then, how was compensation dealt with. They asked if there was a value affixed to that compensation, or is it what would have been the term of determining the type of compensation, and was it established in the legislation?
There was no fixed value. The amendment speaks to compensating the victim in terms of something was damaged, the perpetrator damaged like a car or something, for example, and the person would have to be, the courts can now say that compensation has to be made. So I guess the courts will determine, but there is no set value because there will be different situations.
So we, in fact, now have the opportunity to take it a further step. But that was sort of a low-hanging, quick response, which would send a signal. And I should indicate here that, and Mrs. Robinson, you may want to expand, that the experience that we have had in treating with victims of domestic violence, some of them have been very heartrending. And we have, through the Bureau, assisted a number of victims to not just come to the shelter, but if they wish to be placed somewhere else, we would pay the rent, and we also assist in placing the children back in school. Mrs. Robinson, you may want to just expand on that program and how we have even been able to teach them skills so that they become employable after they've left that abusive relationship.
Excuse me, I'm so sorry to interrupt. Madam Chair, Minister.
I'm hearing you.
This is Marlene Aldred. I had my hand up to speak on the issue about compensation to victims, but I also see that Mrs. Seeley Brown the consultant drafter also has her hand up, and I suspect it might be to speak on the same point. So I was wondering if we could just get an opportunity to speak on the issue of compensation before you move on.
Mrs.
My
Ross?
issue, SG, is a wider issue, however, but I would let you speak first.
Go ahead, Cecilia. Yeah?
Oh, okay. So Mrs. Celia Brown has yielded to me, Marlene Aldred, Solicitor General. Just to point out that there was an amendment to the Criminal Justice Administration Act some years ago, and it applies across the board. Once a person is convicted of a criminal offense, the court that hears the matter and pronounces sentence also may provide compensation to victims who are identified, and there's a list of there's some criteria set out in the law on a number of matters that the court can have regard to. So it's not just financial compensation. It's varied and it is quite comprehensive, and that applies to any person who has been convicted of a criminal offense. So I just wanted to point that out, that it already exists in law. What I was hearing Senator Gale speak about, it exists in law once someone has been convicted of an offense. It's a very comprehensive scheme that is in the Criminal Justice Administration Act. We would not encourage it was put in the Criminal Justice Administration Act for a reason, similar to how we put very general and certain matters in the Interpretation Act that apply across all acts. There are a number of matters that are addressed in the Criminal Justice Administration Act that apply in certain situations. This means that you don't have to keep putting all of these provisions in each law. You have it in one act that applies across. So we wouldn't encourage that section in the Criminal Justice Administration Act to be duplicated in the Domestic Violence Act because it already applies.
Thank you so much for your clarification, SG. Very clear to us. Right, Senator Gale?
Yes, Chair, I'm satisfied with that representation by Solicitor General. Once it applies there and where it's dependent on this one, I'm good with it. Thanks for that clarification.
Yeah, thank you so much. Mrs. Celia Brown, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, I just want us to be mindful of the fact that when we had done the review to which the report that you're referring, more emphasis was placed on the Sexual Offences Act. So when persons made submissions, those submissions, even though they may have touched on concern, other acts which may have affected the Sexual Offences Act in some way, those submissions were not discrete to the Domestic Violence Act. And so I would think that we would want stakeholders to probably come back and give their assessment, focusing on the Domestic Violence Act in this joint select, not necessarily disregarding what was said in the former report, but as I said earlier, that report would have been more specifically dealing with the Sexual Offences Act.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Celia Brown. I think, Minister Johnson Smith, I see your hand up. You wanted to make a comment?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, Chair, thank you very much, and my apologies for lateness, and also for not being present, as I had every intention so to be. I just caught this last comment made by Mrs. Celia Brown, and I just wanted to comment on the fact that the report is quite clear in terms of its distinct references to the legislation that was being considered. And while more persons or more time may have been spent on the other pieces of legislation, which is what has brought about this Joint Select Committee, that is that it was felt that not sufficient time was spent on fleshing out some of the issues in related to the domestic violence, that there has been, that entities took a choice or made choices as to what they wanted to emphasize. And I don't think, or rather, I would hope that we don't lose too much time in creating new issues where a lot of work has already been done to actually create draft amendment legislation, which was being considered. I have to apologize because I'm speaking having missed the first half hour of the meeting. So my context may be wrong, but I think the report doesn't seek to do any more or less than it states. It says what was being considered in respect of the Joint Select Committee on domestic violence. So I'm not understanding the point that she was making.
Thank you, Minister Johnson Smith. Senator Gale.
Chair, committees will tend to appear before joint select committees and promote the areas of concerns to them. I recall when we were doing the sexual harassment legislation, a number of respondents came and spoke more against the violence against the people, sexual offenses act, but not specifically dealing with harassment. And so you will find respondents coming and detailing recommendations into areas that concerns them the most. It is the committee now, having heard those deliberations, would make a determination into what would be relevant as an application, and may even make recommendations as to how those other recommendations can apply to other legislations that would have been out of the committee's remit.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Mrs. Robinson, could you make a comment in relation to the definition?
I would reference initially the National Strategic Action Plan to eliminate gender-based violence in Jamaica as a starting point for the treatment of persons who would need this kind of support, whether it is monetary compensation or it is psychological support and counseling, which is done through the National Shelter Unit, the Gender-Based Violence Helpline Unit, and other parts of the gender architecture, because it's not just the government of Jamaica who has that response. We have NGOs who are a part of the gender architecture, and we work as a team. So in terms of how that reparation and redress provisions are made, it is a combination of a number of parts based on what is required. So there would have been an initial interrogation, we'd like to call it, of the matter. So the person would bring forward their case very, very explicitly and as comprehensively as possible to detail what it is that is required. And our officers would work through, once the report is taken, a safety plan and certainly a plan of action that would allow for a detailed treatment of the case for each person, and how it is that we would have a series of uptakes, things that would be happening along the way to assist the person. The minister mentioned, or chair, mentioned the fact that within the space, that's the National Shelter Unit, which has 2 spaces now that are operational and 1 that's been retrofitted. We have made attempts to have a holistic treatment because we understand that when a victim, we like to call the person a survivor because they did not go under because of the attack. They are still living and existing. So we like to use the survival language, and that is why that continuum of care that we had signed under an MOU 2 years ago spoke to a continuum of care for survivors of gender-based violence. So what we would do is a combination of strategies, and the minister mentioned the holistic approach that we take in the shelters, where we are not only counseling, and providing psychosocial support, but we're also allowing them to learn skills. There are lots of skills training that has taken place, even through project support. We've had partnership with the Canadian High Commission and other entities that have invested in the survivors and their families so that they can actually be working on restoration and rehabilitation, and just for empowerment as well, and to make themselves skilled or upskilling or refreshing skills. Because in some cases, they might have not been employed prior to coming into the space, or they were underemployed, or they had been out of work, or there are a number of issues that we saw when we did the intake and got the responses. So what we did was a number of things that would allow for the treatment. For example, in 2020, 2021, when we had the COVID with us, we had to even have training for students or continuation of learning. We got support through entities that allowed us to have learning tools and learning devices, donation of tablets. We certainly made sure that within our space and within our budget, we did what we could to resource that. And then, of course, because of altruism that is alive and well, we had persons who jumped on and supported us under, again, that same continuum of care and just that regard for life and continuation of life. Because we felt that those children, for example, and those teenagers, some of them were adolescents, who were doing CSEC and needed to do their SBAs and stuff, they could not continue unless there was some support that was required. So it's a holistic kind of treatment. So while they might not have gotten monetary compensation at all times, even though there were times when we had to do that, the minister also mentioned alternate housing. There are times when they could not go to a safe space, because for the safe space, based on the nature of the space, it requires restricted movement. And so they were not able to commute. So if the person was in employment, they would not be able to leave from that safe space to go to work. The children would not be able to leave from that safe space to go to school. And so it meant that we had to look at alternatives. So the person cannot come to this space and be restricted for safety for themselves, the family members, and those who are on staff, and to make sure that they are protected from any other attacks that would have come based on their vulnerability. We had to partner, again, the partnership comes up, with other entities to have alternate spaces where they could go to those spaces and remain there for a specific period and be supported by the gender-based violence helpline unit, the social workers in that unit, and as well other parts of the continuum of care where we had the JCF, for example. We have had a very close-knit relationship with the domestic violence intervention centers. And so we're certainly happy when the numbers increased through Spotlight Initiative, which of course I must mention here that Spotlight Initiative was a very huge support to us that allowed us to do quite a few things during the period that Spotlight was on. It was for 2 years, and during that period we were able to do so much as partners. That's the EU and the UN group in Jamaica. And of course, finally, to say that because of the fact that we know how important it is to have this kind of support, so that persons who are in this space understand that while we treat with it while they are in this space, the expectation is that we follow them through and we keep that money after they leave, because some of them end up spending longer in the physical space, for example, because they are not yet ready to move into a safe space. We do not allow them to go back to where they were violated and it was unsafe, because that really would not be solving the issues. So we at times have to look for something that will allow them to move from where they are when they leave the shelter to a safe space and where the children can be safe. And sometimes when they're leaving, we have to give them a gift. We can get some of the tablets that we had, sometimes we have to give the children to take with them, because if we don't, then they would not be able to continue their learning. And we have also been supported through, we have a clothing bank that's very, very comprehensively stacked because of, again, altruism is live, and there are so many persons who just call us to say they have some gifts that they want to donate. And of course, we also have that on our budget, that we keep the supplies going, because the staff in the shelters are government operated and paid by the government of Jamaica. And so when they leave, we also assist with the relocation and continue to support them as outpatients or as persons who are not within the space but still a part of the shelter system until it is that they have recovered. And some of them have come back as success stories. I remember, Minister, when we had the site visit from the gentleman overseas. That was when the EU had that visit, remember, a couple of years ago. And he was very impressed that one of the survivors came back and she spoke very well about the support that she had received from this space and how she was able to help her children. And the children, having been in that space and were supported while they were in this space during COVID-19, were doing so well in school. And so we've had success stories and we've had testimonials. And so we believe that the investment that we've made and that we continue to make is working and it's worth it. So partnerships for us is very important. I trust, Minister, that I have responded adequately to what you've asked. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Robinson. Senator Johnson-Smith, you may wish to.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. I was wondering about an issue that I believe you were raising earlier about the outstanding matters, and I believe you may have made reference to the definition of domestic violence, and I wondered if legal counsel or the AG's chambers, if they could help us on where we are with that, and whether there is any appetite to have focused submissions on that. Is that something that sufficient progress has been made on? Just to better understand this space. Again, apologies for having been late, so I may have missed some things.
Thank you, Senator Johnson-Smith. And I would ask members who are online if you could turn your cameras on, because we are live on television. Go ahead, Mrs. Rock, can you? Or Mrs. Blackwood would want to take that.
First amendment, we had a list of definitions which we thought were important to include in the Act. So we have those, and I think there were some suggestions from the last committee on other things that they felt should be in the Act. So we can revisit it, but we did have a list of definitions which we thought would be important in the Act.
I don't know if the Solicitor General or Mrs. Celia Brown may want to make a comment regarding the definition.
Not at this time for me, Chair.
All right, thank you. Senator Gale?
Is it the definition itself or is it definitions in general that would form part of the first area of the legislation in terms of section 2 in general?
Which you wanted to place in the Act.
So
the definition of domestic violence. My question was about the definition of domestic violence.
Oh, okay. Because if it was definitions in general, my preference in approach would be to listen to those who would be making presentations. And those presentations or recommendations might impact areas of the legislation which would require us then to create definitions or interpretations to support those changes. So I like to leave that particular area to be the last area that we treat with.
Thank you, Senator Gale.
But just to say that, but just to clarify though, Senator Gale, you recognize though that the fundamental nature of the definition of domestic violence is actually a substantive part of the Act. I just wanted to be clear that you're making a distinction between that and that body of work that was being undertaken at the time of the last report versus the general approach to definitions under Section 2, which I agree with you is normally the last part of the work, because the issues come up and you sort of tabulate, and then towards the end you pull all of those together. I agree with you. But domestic violence as a definition, was actually one of the more difficult areas, if I recall correctly. So I'm hoping that you're supporting us treating with that earlier rather than later.
Thank you, Senator.
Of course, Minister Johnson-Smith, I'm right there with you in terms of the importance and the priority.
Thank you, Minister Johnson-Smith. And you will know on your matrix, it's listed here, where some recommendations made in relation to what the definition should include. So what I would like to encourage members to do is to go through the matrix so that at our next meeting, we can zero in on some of these areas, because we need to get to work, so to speak, instead of speaking in general terms. So we need to look at the matrix and pick areas that we feel we could look at, come to some understanding while we await presentations. Because the matrix is reflecting submissions that were made previously. And this is everything. All submissions that were made, those submissions are reflected in this matrix. Any additional areas to be looked at would come from new presentations or updated presentations. Senator Longmore, you wish to say something?
We decided the route that we're going to take regarding the previous submissions. Have we decided that we're going to either just update the ones that may have presented already? So we will probably give them a guide as to what they did before, so we're not repeating, and then just get updates from them, or are we just going to proceed with new presenters?
We will write to those who made presentations previously and ask them if they would wish to update their presentations, or if what they have already presented are the areas that they wish to highlight. Of course, we had an ad. We placed an ad in the newspapers. I'm going to ask that we also do online to make use of the space, the social media space, so that we can get persons interested in coming to make presentations. I don't know what response we have had from the ad. We haven't had any. We haven't had any response from the advertising, so we probably need to do some more. All right? So we'll do some more. All right, I understand we have 2 more ads to appear in the newspapers, but I would want us to add social media. Yes? All right, so we have to ramp it up then. All right, I understand social media posts were sent to members, and you're being asked to share those posts widely.
Sorry, Madam Chair.
So those posts were actually put on the Parliament's social media platform. But I've asked the clerk to have them send them directly to us, and then we can share them. Who was it? Senator, Minister Johnson-Smith, you wanted to say something? I don't see anybody's hand up.
I just took it down, Madam Chair. I just revisited it. I just took it down. I wondered if there had been any discussion about the draft bill which had been which was being worked on the basis of the submissions that had been made previously, and that on which, if I recall correctly, in terms of being briefed, there had been significant progress made. Is the intention to just sort of hold that until we have had new submissions updated, etc., and then we try to update and bring that into the committee, or is the intention to just sort of carve out and have that put aside and simply work on new submissions, whether they come back or not, and a new report that that really just looked at the original bill as amended by the last amendment bill that we passed? Is there any attempt to, maybe if I rephrase, is there any attempt to include in our deliberations the draft which was already being worked on, but understandably not sufficiently progressed to have made its way to Parliament because it was anticipated that there would be another joint select? I'm just trying to think about how we can reduce duplication of effort. And I may be overthinking the point. It may be that there's no role for that to be part of this process. But I wondered if it was something that was being considered by the technical teams in terms of how to leverage the work already done, whether there is a stage at which it could be appropriately incorporated, or whether we're really starting tabula rasa. This is all we're doing that would leverage what was done before, is to write to the people who had made submissions before to ask them if they wish to update, and to revert to consideration of the submissions that have been made, and then not transparent to the committee, the technical teams at the AGC and CPC, etc., start their work again. I'm just trying to understand the process at this stage and how we can be most efficient with our work, given how very important and necessary this new act will be.
Thank you, Minister Johnson-Smith. I'll ask Ms. Blackwood. From what my understanding is that there is a draft bill, and if Ms. Blackwood could just clarify that, and that could guide us going forward.
We were working on a draft bill with CPC, the AGC's chambers, and going forward, I think we can, based on our submissions, we can add to what that bill, because most of those matters would have been considered by AGC, CPC. So those matters, I think, would basically be settled. So it's for us to we can just add based on the submissions we now have to the draft bill.
I don't know if the Solicitor General or Mrs. Celia Brown may wish to comment. Go ahead, Senator.
Chair, I'm sorry, this is Marlene Aldred. I didn't hear that. I think something went wrong with my system. Could that be repeated, please?
Yes, I'll ask Ms. Blackwood, and then you can, if you could take it from there. Thank you.
I was explaining that we had worked on the draft bill with the CPC, AGC's chambers. So there are matters in there which were discussed and were agreed by all the parties. So now we'll have new submissions, and that can be added to what we had already discussed. Like, for instance, we had looked at some definitions, etc. So we can now add things to that to come up with a new draft bill for consideration.
So, SG, you may wish to add a comment there.
Yeah, I'm not really clear about a draft bill. You're at a joint select committee meeting, so what usually the process is that the joint select will go through the bill, not Joint Select Committee will go through the Act, section by section. The Joint Select Committee will also consider all the input from the different stakeholders. And then the Joint Select Committee will take decisions whether they think there should be any amendments that the CPC would then draft a bill or draft amendments. It doesn't necessarily have to be a bill. It depends on how extensive the comments and the decisions are. So the CPC could be tasked to either draft amendments to the existing Act, or if it's very extensive, the committee could ask the officer from the Office of the Parliamentary Council to prepare a repeal and replace piece of legislation. So we wouldn't be putting forward any like a bill right now, because it's really for the Joint Select Committee to go through and take some decisions on the Act as it is now and where you want the Act to go.
Thank you, SG. So, Minister Johnson Smith, the way forward would be based on the Solicitor General's guidance, where we'll review the current legislation and make the amendments, recommendations through the bill, and then the Act is written. So we wouldn't be repealing, but rather amending to update the Domestic Violence Act.
If you excuse me, though, Chair, just to say, there are times when, so the intention is to do a review and suggest amendments. The reason I suggested that you may have to consider repeal is it depends on how extensive the amendments are. So if you have amendments to almost every section of the law, it would be, I mean, the drafter can come in here, but normally the better technique would be to repeal and replace. So I think it's nearer to the end of your deliberations, you will perhaps have a better feel for whether you'll be proposing amendments or you will actually be proposing a repeal and replacement of the law, because it really depends on how extensive the amendments will be.
You're quite correct. It depends on, as Chair, the nature of the amendments, and especially if we're going to be including definitions and expanding terms and that sort of thing. We can't say for sure just yet whether or not we will be repealing and replacing or amending. That would happen at the end of the process, Chair.
All right, thank you so much. Senator Gale?
For the start of these proceedings, in my mind, I was looking at where we have a legislation already. And so I was looking at where there would have been possible amendments or additions to the existing legislation. When you go to the extent of a repeal, it would have, as Solicitor General had said, it would have to be so expansive in nature that you would want to change the entire legislation. I don't believe we're at that stage yet without hearing from those who would be presenting proposed changes. What I think we need to do is two things. Ms. Blackwood, you would have indicated that there would have been some proposed recommendations. So provide us with those proposed recommendations and allow the committee to examine them and to see clarity where clarity may be required, and let us see how those recommendations can be incorporated. And then, Chair, let us hear from those who are making submissions. And once we get a feel of what would constitute that forward matrix, then we can make a determination in terms of where we're going.
Thank you, Senator Gale. Anyone else wishes? Yes, Senator Fraser-Binns, go ahead.
Thank you, Minister. I am not sure if what I'm about to say was already said because I lost connection and had to reconnect. But my own thought is that it would be useful, notwithstanding the draft that exists in whatever stage, that we can share that for guidance. But I think the consideration has to be done after everyone has submitted. Even the different persons, different stakeholders who submitted, they submitted in 2018. So a number of years would have passed since those submissions. So I agree with both yourself and Senator Scott Motley in terms of giving them an opportunity to see if they want to revise their submission. But not only that, because when one looks at the two lists, that is the list of persons who submitted before and those who are inviting to submit, then you see that the one that we are inviting to submit is far more extensive than the list that was submitted. And I think that we should hear their comments, their recommendations before we get into, not sure if you're hearing me, but before we get into the discussion in terms of what already exists by way of the draft bill. And Minister, I'm going to make a proposal which is perhaps a little unconventional, but I wonder whether there would be any scope for meetings outside of the Parliament with persons. And I say this because the incidence of domestic violence has become more and more rampant in recent times, and I thought perhaps not everybody would be able to journey into Kingston to make a submission, and some persons perhaps just simply do not want to journey into Kingston. But given the very serious nature of this bill, well, the revision, I thought perhaps we could consider, and a decision doesn't have to be made today, but we could consider perhaps 3 meetings outside of Kingston in communities or in town centers where we can hear from persons. So I'm putting that out for consideration.
Thank you, Senator Fraser-Binns. Yes, we should consider reaching out, maybe town hall meetings or community meetings. We could look at the possibilities of hosting some of those meetings. So that's a matter we can discuss further. In fact, the Bureau of Gender Affairs asked Mrs. Robinson to speak to approximately 19 organizations we have across Jamaica they work closely with the Bureau in treating with gender matters. So you may want to speak a little to those, and then we could work through them to set up these community meetings. Yeah.
Extremely happy about that injection of support, because as you know or not, the Bureau of Gender Affairs exists in one space in Halfway Free, outside of the shelters that we have outside. But the tremendous support we get from those members who are on COPE, that's the Community Outreach through Partnership for Empowerment Initiative. At this point, the number that we have is less than 20, but the reach is so far and wide that it allows us to do things that we would not normally do within our 4 walls outside of the community. So we have, for example, the Jamaica Network of Rural Women Producers, and that group is extremely important because a lot of those women in those groups have extreme vulnerabilities to a number of social shocks, and that came out very clearly in COVID-19. So in terms of arranging and organizing at the community level, we also have other groups. There's Enough is Enough. That's a group that does a significant amount of work on gender-based violence and domestic violence in general as a form of gender-based violence, through retired commissioner, acting commissioner, what was it, deputy commissioner of police, ACP, was it ACP? Noblet Grant. I think we all know Ms. Grant. She did significant amount of work. And now that she's retired from the public service, she is investing her talent and time in working with persons across Jamaica. They would go across Jamaica through support from COPE and have sensitization and awareness raising sessions with a number of groups and communities, just sharing definitions of domestic violence, how it works, what is in place for persons who are so aggrieved, and also for those who wish to get support, and how it is that the redress kicks in, and just about what is in place for the support. And to have persons recognize that they can be advocates as well against this scourge of gender-based violence, to make sure that they are watching in their communities and becoming parts of support groups and taking actions also. So yes, we do have that support across. We also have men's groups who are a part of COPE, and they would also be poised to assist us to have the mobilization, which is very important, at the community level for those town hall meetings that Minister is talking about, and just getting into those communities that will not necessarily be able to come to Kingston or to hear about it. So I quite love what Senator Fraser-Bin said about taking it to them, going out there and to meet them in their spaces. This is something we do in our community liaison unit at the Bureau of Gender Affairs, where we go to them. We call it pound the corner reasoning and sidewalk hustle, and just about anything that they would like to hear about the legislation, and using their language, breaking it down, making it simple, not necessarily using our brochures that we would give to persons in MDAs, but using simple language and just allowing them to ask questions and to understand exactly, because we believe that they also have a role to play. The participatory approach is one of the 4 pillars of our national policy for gender equality. So we know that they need to also know that they need to play a role in how gender mainstreaming is done, and gender-based violence is very big. So we want them to know that if it is that they are aggrieved or they know someone who is aggrieved, they can also be an advocate for the cause. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Mrs. Robinson. I'm not sure if you mentioned that we provide these organizations with a monthly subvention, so it assists in their outreach program. So excellent idea to reach out to the communities, and we will come back to the meeting with some recommendations and a possible schedule of a series of meetings. Go ahead.
Ms. Robb, when you go to these communities, does the communities respond in terms of attendance?
Absolutely, Senator Gale. They do respond. And it's easier for them because they don't have to travel to Kingston. And so what we do, we use town centers, churches, town halls, and spaces, community centers, spaces that they would normally be able to traverse and to get to. And we have persons on the ground itself who would be like community mobilizers. And they will be able to round up those persons and, you know, convince them by moral suasion to come to the sessions because of the importance of it. While we don't necessarily have town criers going around, we do have persons on the ground who are, we call, advocates for the cause. And so they can assist us to mobilize. So yes, they will come out. And the good thing, sometimes they bring the family. They will bring a male with them, the male in the house, and they will bring children and neighbors. So yes, we do get.
And so they'll be more responding to your organization being the host and being the inviter.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
Fine.
So what I'm recommending that we would do it as the Joint Select Committee in collaboration with the entities that are involved in our gender, that's part of our gender machinery across the island. Clark is asking me to confirm, or for Senator Gale to indicate, but the Joint Select Committee would want to have do an outreach program into communities, and I am.
Question.
All right, let me hear from Senator Gale. Okay, Minister Johnson-Smith, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think it's a great idea, and I just wanted to understand it just a little bit more. Would the intention be, because we all know domestic violence is an issue, it deeply needs attention from a legislative perspective and from operational perspective, and that's why we're here trying to strengthen the law, which is insufficient and outdated. So we're here to address its weaknesses. At this stage, is it anticipated that outreach would be asking communities questions as what they would like to see, what protections do they think should be in the law, and also allow for some sensitization aspect that would allow for sharing things like now, you know, the police can confiscate guns from a premises. more people can apply for protection orders, sharing what is a protection order, etc. I don't know if that type of sensitization fits within the remit of the Joint Select Committee, but this is why I'm asking, at this stage where we haven't yet formulated the new protections or the new mechanisms of strengthening, would the intention of the Joint Select Committee in reaching out at this stage, as opposed to at a later stage where we'd be saying, these are some of the things that we're proposing, what do you think of them from a community perspective in terms of their utility to you as a woman or as a man or as a child in a violent household? At this stage, can you just share, perhaps through you, perhaps Senator Fraser-Binns could share a little more about whether she is in fact thinking that that should take place now or a little later, or whether she has a sense of the type of questions that she thinks would appropriately be put to communities at this stage of our review to ensure that they're useful, they're productive, that people feel engaged with the parliamentary process, and that we are not only meeting the needs and spending taxpayers' money in going out in the communities effectively and sensibly, but we're also bringing people into a process in a way that gives and adds value to the amendments that are eventually to be made. So just to understand your thinking a little bit more in the broader context of how the Joint Select Committees operate. Thank you, through you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you.
From my perspective, it would be sensitization as well as allowing persons outside. Kingston is not Jamaica, and allowing persons outside of the corporate area and persons who are unable to travel to Kingston, to give them an opportunity to make their input. When we do it, at what time we do it, would be determined by the Joint Select Committee as to when we schedule those activities. That's from my perspective. I think Senator Fraser-Binns wanted to say something, and then I'll take you. Who was? Oh, Senator Longmore, and then Senator Gale. Go ahead, Senator
Thank
Longmore.
you, Minister. I must say that my thinking is not very far from yours. In fact, I raised that suggestion because we have to, as parliamentarians, and my very short years of sitting on the committee has taught me that there are so much more that we can learn when we take matters to people. And I believe that given the very important role that this piece of legislation is going to play in terms of how we relate to, we deal with gender-based violence, then it can only help us if we take it to the community, have them share with us what they believe would be an effective way to treat with gender-based violence. I do believe that there are recommendations that will be coming out of these interactions that can then influence the final decisions that we make. We may not accept them, but certainly it is worth considering. And a part of it also has to do, Minister, with the fact that as we contemplate the kind of country we want, then we have to recognize that Kingston is not Jamaica. We have to recognize that there are persons who may not be able to traverse to Kingston for one reason or another, but they have recommendations, they have a story to tell, they have things that they can share that will help us to make better laws. And it is in that background why I made a suggestion that we take the consultation to them. It's not going to be any different from what happens now, where persons make written submission and we ask them questions. But perhaps the persons who need our intervention the most are not able to make written submissions. And so we're giving them that opportunity to talk with us, to share with us what they believe would help them and other persons who are survivors of domestic violence.
Thank you, Senator Fraser-Binns. I'll take Senator Longmore, and then Minister Johnson-Smith, and then Senator Gale. You're going to yield to Senator Gale? Please go ahead, Brian.
So nice. Chair, you know, as a trade unionist, I have learned that when you're making decisions on behalf of workers, you go to the workers. This is a piece of legislation that we are trying to improve that is for both the protection and prevention, and also proposes and promotes a change in behavior in society. And not everyone is going to want to come to Gordon House or come to the Parliament. Some people just watch the Parliament on television, but they would hope that they could make recommendations to those legislations that are going to impact them. This is a real opportunity for us to go into a community or a set of communities and engage. I kind of like the approach, well, Minister Johnson Smith was seeking clarity on an approach. And I believe we can take, in the first instance, the recommendations coming from those who would have responded, formulate and determine where we're going, and go to the people and suggest some of these to the people to see if the people will really respond to it. And in addition to that, we can get feedback from them that can be added to whatever we are proposing. So I kind of like the idea, and this is one of them that really is intended on changing behavior in the society. So those who are abusers, we may change them. Those who are being abused can further understand what we are doing in terms of improving our legislation to impact them. So I like the idea.
Thank you, Senator Gale. Minister Johnson Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The first thing I would like to make clear, because both yourself and Senator Fraser-Binns made reference, is that for the record, I do not believe Kingston is Jamaica. That wasn't the basis of my query. It was really just to understand the thinking about how we make it a useful process, because it's easy and well and good to speak about engaging with the public, but you want it to be useful. You want them to find it useful, and you want the process itself to contribute to the legislative process that we're about. So I was really just asking in that regard, and I think it would be good for us also to remain aware of the opportunities for virtual presentations. So I think it might be good if in the letters that are being written, that we do make clear that should persons have difficulties in attending the Parliament, that we're willing to offer them the opportunity to participate virtually, so that they know upfront that it's not a function. Our request for their submission is not based on their ability to be here. The process around community engagement, I think, can be thought out a little more, as has been suggested by both yourself and Senator Fraser-Binns. But I do think that that it would be a nice or a good addition to our process, recognizing the opportunity that does exist, that when we write persons, we indicate that the opportunity exists once you have made a written submission to present it and to answer questions virtually, that it doesn't require to be physically present in Parliament, if that is the mind of the meeting in terms of how we ensure engagement and ensure a clear understanding, not only that Kingston is not Jamaica, but also that we are now a modern Parliament as best as possible, using technology to facilitate our population's engagement with the Parliament. So I just wanted to make that point clear. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Minister Johnson Smith. Senator Longmore.
Thank you, Chair. They say there are no coincidences, and I've sat here and I've been contemplative. I shared with Kavan an experience that I'm presently having, and I have been processing whether or not I should share it. But the fact that the phone call came just as the meeting was convened, I say, you know what? And it's very relevant to what is being discussed here. First, let me just say that I'm in agreement with the public discourse, and I think especially the ads that we place on social media and in the newspapers, that we should indicate that virtual contributions, as Minister Johnson Smith indicated, is an avenue for contribution. I also would want us to contemplate more on the side of the public's education after the process and town hall meetings at that time. The situation that I'm dealing with, I got called from one of my residents. And there's a 29-year-old female who was beaten by her partner to the point where after he slammed her head in the wall, he continued to kick her. And this was the beating happened about a week or two ago. She's now presented in basically a catatonic state, meaning that she has gone mute, she's not eaten, she's in basically a state of shock. So one of the first things I asked was whether or not the incident was reported and why, and they said a police report was made, but he got bail later the same day. And essentially, she has been in such fear that even though there has not been continued attack physically, just the apprehension. And I go on to say, well, there can be a restraining order put out. And the mother is of the fear that even she, the mother, is fearful of the process of going back to the police station and the community being aware. But they don't want to leave their community. That is one. And she was not even aware of the fact that the police could escort her to go to fetch the things from the young ladies, from where the young lady was living. I'm saying all of this to say that this process of revisiting what we have already is really very important. And I think that we also need to consider, because in that scenario, there are 3 children who are exposed to the beating. And the cycle of domestic violence is one that we have to, as we are contemplating how we address it, we have to also seek how we can address the cycle. And we don't have the Jamaica Teachers Association here listed, but our schools and what we're seeing in our schools and what our teachers are sometimes exposed to could be quite telling. And when we go out there, as Senator Fraser-Binns advocated for, recognize that a victim, even in that space, will not come forward. Unfortunately. They are so fearful that even though you are taking it to them, they will not come forward. This is why the JPA and the JAMPSYC would be very important to have here. But I put it further for us to consider possibly the Jamaica Teachers Association. And I know we have the Ministry of Education and Youth represented, but I think specifically our teachers who might be exposed to the evidence of the cycle continuing. And just lastly to say that my advocacy is for some of these town hall engagements to be occurring post the process or after, so that we can inform our public as to what are the ramifications and the avenues that they have as interventions when they are victims of domestic violence. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Longmore. Mrs. Robinson, you may wish to make some comments in this regard.
I'm listening to Senator Sapphire Longmore, and that is not something that we like to hear. That particular case that you mentioned, we have had several of those cases and we've had to deal with them. And because of the continuum of care, we would do that in collaboration with the police, the JCF. If it is that that person is loose, in terms of, you mentioned that the person got bail soon after, that is same day. That is, it's unfortunate, because I remember, for example, some years ago, there was an attempt to retain persons such as perpetrators who were not able to see reason. So there was something that had come up where they would keep them. I can't remember the expression they used at that point, but they were retained once it is that they found. Right. They would hold them for a while, talk sense into their head really, let them understand that what they did is wrong and hold them for a little longer. And that would allow some reprieve for the person who is aggrieved and that person who is vulnerable, so that if it is that you're moving them to a safe space or you're doing some kind of rehabilitation treatment and stuff, it could be done during that period. So that says to me that even though we have done so much work with the JCF, and there is a DVIX which now has increased to 10 spaces, there's still significant amount of work to be done in terms of just making sure that all of the police officers and all of the persons in the sector are aware that when a case comes in, you have to look at it holistically to ensure that the person who is aggrieved does not suffer. Because, you know, what you mentioned about this person who has become mute, in a state of shock and so on, nobody should be subjected to that kind of violence. And so many times when we hear that, the shock that comes to us, and immediately we kick into action to say, who are the parties that we will need to contact and how do we move quickly to get that done. So I think perhaps we can speak outside of here to see how, because I know definitely that the JCF, we just had training, for example, with the Jamaica National Police College of Jamaica, with 18 of our staff members were trained, but that is in relation to sexual harassment, but it is still a form of gender-based violence, and we have a very close relationship with the police. There's DSP Dillon and our team at the DVIX, and I'm not certain if they're aware of the case and how much underground work has been done in terms of just connecting the dots. So that's something we could look at afterwards, but there is not a case where something happens and it's isolated. Once persons are aware of it, then what happens is that those entities and those bodies would kick in terms of the response. Because we are concerned about this person and her family. You mentioned that the family, there's tension in the community. I recall at one point we had something similar and the minister mandated us to go in. And we took social service providers with us from CPFSA, Victim Services Division, Sisoko, and just converged on the space and gave the family the support and continue to monitor. So that's something we definitely can look at to make sure that all parties are treated with and that doesn't continue, especially for the children who will be traumatized significantly and will have to have that kind of damage control done to make sure that they do not suffer later and latent damage.
Thank you, Mrs. Robinson. So at this point, I think we may wish to wrap up this session. Give you an opportunity to go through the matrix for the next meeting. The report of the Joint Select Committee looking at the offenses against the person Act, the Domestic Violence Act, and the Child Care and Protection Act. That report has been circulated to you. The list of stakeholders who participated in the Sexual Harassment Act, JSC, they will now be written to and invited to make submissions.
Sexual offenses.
Yes, sexual offenses. It was the combination of the various pieces of legislation that JSC. You have an opportunity to read the report, and then for those who participated in the Sexual Harassment Act meetings and presentations, that we invite them to make submissions to this JSC regarding the Domestic Violence Act. Those who made submissions, we'll be writing to them to ask if they want to update their submissions, or we should proceed to look at those submissions that were already made by them. Go ahead, Senator Longmore.
Thank you. Just checking if there's any consideration for my suggestion around the JTA, Jamaica Teachers Association.
Yes, I was about to indicate that the 3 organizations you mentioned have been added to the list. They have been added to the list. So And of course, we will increase our social media. Yes, virtually. And we'll be sending the links to you so you can share. So at this point, I don't know. Oh, go ahead, Miss West.
Are you hearing me? Thank you. So from the legal reform standpoint, we know that each stakeholder will present unique perspectives having regard to their specialized focus. But for us here, from the legal reform, from a legal reform standpoint, what we would particularly be interested in would be the feedback or proposals from the gender-based entities, and particularly the statements or feedback from victims, because we're looking at the legislation with a view to improving or to do away with the existing deficiencies, and who is best able or best able to advise us on what the existing deficiencies are than the victims themselves. And so we're particularly interested in hearing from the gender-based entities, for example, the Woman Inc. I know that they would have worked with the task force years ago, and they have useful information to assist in this regard. As well, we would also be minded to suggest proposal or for the National Task Force Against Trafficking in Persons to be a potential stakeholder. Why? It may be viewed as a bit unpopular, but sometimes you may have domestic violence victims being marked as a sex trafficking victim or a labor trafficking victim as well. And so there is a connection, or there can be a connection between domestic violence and human trafficking. And so we think that that could also be considered, to have a representative from the task force to present on this as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. West. I would ask you to provide the clerk with a list, all right? So we can reach out to those entities. Thank you. So, members, any further comments, any further inputs? So what I'd like to recommend at this time is that we had discussed at our first meeting that we would meet. Is it bi-weekly? What I'm going to recommend at this time, that we allow ourselves a little bit more time between this meeting and the next meeting for us to write to the various stakeholders, increase our social media outreach, have the additional ads appear in the newspaper, and to ensure that the next meeting we have, we will be able to indicate the stakeholders who have responded to us. And it would allow you time also to go, once again, go through the report of the Joint Select Committee that reviewed the various pieces of legislation, as well as the matrix, so that when next we meet, we can determine the way forward in dealing with some specific matters, so that we can really get right to it to make some decisions for the report. I don't know if Senator Gale, Senator Longmore, my colleagues online, if anyone wishes to say anything further, or I just ask for someone to move for the adjournment.
So moved, Madam Chair. I think the time is an excellent decision so that we can allow the submissions to come in. People can read remind themselves or refresh their understanding of the submissions that are made, so that our engagements with people who come to defend their presentations or to share their perspectives with us in person or virtually, that they will be that much more informed, and our questions will be that much more guided. So I appreciate the approach which you're suggesting. And you have your motion.
Yes. Thank you, Senator Johnson-Smith. So motion moved by Minister Johnson Smith and seconded by Senator Cavan Gale. Thank you. And so the meeting, I didn't ask if there's any other business. I guess there's no other business. And so on the motion for adjournment, I now say that this meeting is adjourned. Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you members, and thanks to the technical team.